Welcome back, everybody, to episode 29 of the Bound to Improve podcast, where we read a book a week and we try to break down the complex ideas from that book and turn them into actionable steps for progress. My name is Chris Pound.
My name is Landon Eller, and the book that we read this week is The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. So, kicking it off right away, who is Eric Ries? He's an entrepreneur and author best known for the book that we read, The Lean Startup. This book popularized the methodology of rapid experimentation, iterative product development, and validated learning in startups. And he co-founded IMVU, which is a 3D social networking and virtual world platform. And now he advises multiple startups and advocates for a scientific approach to business innovation.
Yeah, we found that there were 5 main principles within this book. And so we'll kind of list all 5 of them out, and then we'll go into our main takeaways of the book. First being, entrepreneurs are everywhere. A startup is any human institution creating new products under extreme uncertainty.
Yeah, so it's not just your entrepreneurs building the next big thing in your mom's basement. It could be a different department within your current organization. It could be really anywhere that involves uncertainty.
Yeah.
Next is entrepreneurship is management. This has to come from the top down. Your management team has to implement the principles that Eric Ries lays out.
Yeah, then we kind of go into the validated learning. The goal of a startup isn't to build a product, but to learn how to build a sustainable business rather. And we will kind of get into what a sustainable business is later.
Next is the build, measure, learn cycle. And this is just a rapid iterative cycle where you want to try to minimize the time throughout that cycle to get the most learning as possible.
Yeah, and lastly here we have innovative accounting. Define metrics that matter, set milestones, and track real progress beyond the vanity metrics.
Yeah, so what was Eric Ries' goal for this book? It was to improve the success rate of new innovation products worldwide.
Going into our first takeaway here is, you're not building a product, you are testing a belief rather. Every startup begins with the leap of faith assumption.
Yeah, so Eric's company, when he co-founded IMVU, he started with the assumption that everyone would want to download their game and connect their existing instant messaging platforms to communicate with their friends. But as they built out that product, they found that that initial assumption was wrong. And this is extremely important because he had to learn that to be able to move on and make the next iteration of his product to be successful.
Yeah, and a lot of times these beliefs are often invisible. You know, people want this, people will pay for this. They'll tell their friends about this product that we're trying to put out to people, but that's not always the case. And so kind of the example that we found interesting was the Steve Jobs example.
Yeah, so Steve Jobs was thinking of the next big thing. So he knew people were using the Walkman, which validated that people would listen to music in a public place using headphones. And he also found that there's a lot of people using Napster, which allowed people to download music, but to slip away from paying for it. So Jobs' leap of faith assumption was that people were willing to pay for the music, and that's what he had to go in and test to see if the iPod would be successful.
Yeah, and this is kind of where validating learning becomes the only real currency. You don't succeed by launching, you succeed by learning what works.
Yeah, so you have to be able to understand who your customer is and what the customer wants, because your vision for that product may be the exact opposite of what your customer wants and will pay for.
So how do you kind of test these assumptions about your product before going all the way through with it?
This is where you build to learn, not to launch. And this is where the principle of the build, measure, learn feedback loop comes into play.
Yeah, and there are really 3 key parts to the build, measure, learn loop. First being build an MVP, a minimum viable product, to test the general assumption that you came up with in the first place. Number 2 is measure. Use real customer behavior rather than guessing. Lastly, you need to learn. Either you're right and you double down, or you're wrong, and that's when you pivot.
Yeah, so going into the first phase here, the build phase, the goal isn't to build something beautiful or the best product ever is out there. It's to test the riskiest assumption as quickly as possible. So take Dropbox, for example. If you're not familiar, it's a file storing and sharing service. And before this was invented, and as the founder was trying to validate if this product would work, the customer didn't even know what they wanted. And the problem was that you couldn't transfer or sync files across devices very easily. So he couldn't go and ask the customer what they wanted because they had no idea. They were never exposed to something like that. So instead of building out the entire product, wasting a whole bunch of time and resources to maybe see if the customers would like it, he did something extremely simple and efficient where he just created a video showing the possibilities of what Dropbox can do and how it would transfer and sync files across devices, and it became a hit and it popped off. So this validated his assumption that this was a major issue of the file sharing services.
Yes, this video that he released was the minimum viable product of Dropbox. The smallest thing that you can do to start the loop, which, going back through the BML loop, you gotta build, measure, and then learn. But you have to build it first. But you wanna be careful in what you're building because you don't wanna go too far and realize that you don't have a product at all.
Yeah, but at the same time, MVPs are not about low quality. It's more about learning per dollar spent. So if you take Eric's first MVP, it was extremely buggy, messy, and really embarrassing. They didn't even want to put it out because they didn't think they were ready. But when they put it out for the first time, nobody even downloaded it. So you can see in that example that he probably took too long to develop an MVP because he wasn't getting feedback and the assumptions that he made were not being validated.
Yeah. So after you built the MVP, what kind of comes after that?
So now that you built your MVP, you have to enter the second phase, or the measure phase. You have to measure what matters or you'll end up fooling yourself. So here's where we connect the principles of validated learning and innovation accounting. First is validated learning means proving assumptions with real world data. So your traditional learning is based on building out the entire product, a bunch of planning, and before getting any feedback. And as you can see, in Eric's example or in Steve Jobs' example, that wouldn't have worked because it would have took way too long and they could have wasted a bunch of resources that didn't allow them to make the pivot that they needed to be successful.
Yeah, validated learning is the process of learning what works. Innovation accounting is the system that keeps track of that learning. Most teams fall into the trap of the vanity metrics, page views, likes, downloads, but these don't guide the decisions. You need actionable metrics, numbers that influence what you want to do rather.
So taking it from our podcast lens, seeing those views from our social media clips or the amount of listeners that we have per podcast episode, those are our what, Chris?
The vanity metrics.
And those don't really mean anything because as we're trying to provide value to you guys, we really want to look for those actual metrics. So that would be the engagements, the likes or the comments in our social media posts, or seeing the average time watched increase from a couple of the first minutes of the podcast to the entire episode.
Yeah, we can kind of get all the views in the world, but if we're not getting the engagement that we're kind of looking for, then we're not providing any value to our audience at all.
Yeah. So how do you set up innovation accounting? First you have to establish a baseline. So this is what are your growth metrics? So that would be me and Chris sitting down and being okay, we need to figure out what we need to do to drive growth and understand how we're providing value.
Yeah.
And that would be through those engagements and the average watch time increasing.
Yes.
Next, we have to tune the engine. So we have to improve those key growth metrics through a whole bunch of small little experiments. What can we do to drive those numbers? Did an experiment work?
Yeah.
Did it not?
It's important to isolate the independent variables as well when you're doing these experiments. Otherwise, if you're testing too many things at one time, you're not really quite sure what correlates with what. And so it's important to make little changes one at a time rather than a lot at one time.
Yeah, so now that you've done those experiments, you put those stats up on the dashboard, and now you have to evaluate. Is it time to pivot or persevere? Which we'll get into in the next section here. But our key takeaway from this section is if your metrics don't help you decide what to do, they're just noise. So you have to be extremely diligent in picking out what metrics will drive the most growth for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's kind of takes us on to our next section here, which is pivot or persevere. At the end of each BML feedback loop presents a decision, either persevere or to pivot. Persevere if the core assumption looks validated, keep going through with your current direction. You need to pivot if not, change direction without changing the total vision as well though.
Yeah, and it's key to understand that pivots are not failures. Eric really brings this home by saying that it's really easy to get attached to the success of your minimum viable product, but at the end of the day, that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to build a sustainable business. So if your MVP fails, it's probably a good thing because you learned what the customer didn't want, and you can go about creating that next MVP that will put you in the right direction.
Yeah.
And another important point he made was your runway for your startup, or how long the business can survive, is not how much dollars you have in the bank or how many investors that you know. It's actually how many times that you are able to make a pivot.
Yeah. How many pivots you have left in the tank.
Yeah. So his example, his IMVU, they pivoted more times than I can count.
Yeah. But however, if they didn't make these pivots when they needed to, there's a good likelihood that we would never have even stumbled across the lean startup, because that's kind of the whole idea, is that you have to fail in order to succeed. And as IMVU understood, they failed with their first MVP. Nobody wanted to download their product in the first place. They actually had to pay people to come in and test out their product. And that's not necessarily the way to go about doing it.
Yeah, their initial assumption where they wanted to connect with initial friends, like we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, was wrong. But what they ended up finding out through using the BML feedback loop is that they wanted to actually connect with strangers through the platform. And that wouldn't have been possible if they didn't make multiple pivots and make it through the BML feedback loop as fast as possible.
Yeah. Learning is only useful if it leads to an action.
The ultimate goal of the build, measure, learn feedback loop is to get through it as fast as possible. Because even if a bigger corporation catches on to what you're doing, as long as you're able to innovate faster than they are, then you're going to be just fine and able to hopefully develop a product that's better and more usable than the big guys.
This loop should really be able to work in reverse as well. Figure out what you need to learn, use innovative accounting to figure out what you need to measure and to know if you are gaining validated learning, and then figure out what product you need to build to run that experiment and get that measurement. So this brings us to our final thoughts. This framework isn't just for startups. It's a universal method for building anything new in conditions of uncertainty.
Yeah, so all of the startups, even if you're just in your normal day job and you're looking for a new way to bring innovative products to your workspace, you have to, every new product starts with some leap of faith assumptions that you're going to have to make. And to be able to make sure that this product succeeds in the marketplace, you have to be able to test and validate those assumptions. So to do that, you enter into the build, measure, learn feedback loop. The first stage here is to build your minimum viable product as quickly and cheaply as possible, so you can try to test those leap of faith assumptions. Next would be to measure using validated learning, which is based off of real experience and customer data, versus your traditional methods of learning where you build out the entire product and then you launch it and try to get feedback then, which will ultimately be probably too late.
Yes.
Then you also have to keep track of your metrics using innovation accounting, which separates actual metrics, which will actually determine how you grow, versus your vanity metrics, which are just some feel good.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Vanity metrics just make you feel good, while innovative accounting is more of they help you make decisions that actually matter.
Yeah. So after you established that baseline and you're measuring your actual metrics, you have to take what you learned from your validated learning experience and make a key decision. Is it time to persevere, keep doubling down on what you're doing, and keep seeing those growth in those actual metrics? Or do you need to pivot, try something new because you're not seeing any headway being made?
Yeah, the best startups, they don't build products, they build learning loops. That's what makes them so innovative. That's what makes a startup, is the ability to adapt to the uncertainty of the situation that they're in. that pretty much wraps up our key takeaways from the Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And so now we'll kind of go into the implementations that we had from last week. And so for me, mine was to take the big goals that I had and make them into smaller, more manageable goals. Something that I can actually measure. It's more of like a SMART goal rather than just a general goal. A SMART goal is a specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and a time frame matter on a goal. And so I'm still in the process of going through that process of finding the goals that I almost find most important at that specific time, and they're constantly changing. But I have seen some improvement and getting things done that are more relevant than other things.
Okay. And this implementation is from the book we read last week, Bill Wash's The Score Takes Care of Itself. And mine was one of the main principles of the book was your standard of performance. Your standard of performance defines who you are as an individual. And this is something that is built out over your lifetime, but something that I need to do more routinely is just get out of my comfort zone. So I tried to take a step in that by speaking on a panel last week, and I don't like public speaking.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you feel like, we've read 27 different books so far in the last 8 months. Do you feel like you've been able to incorporate the things that we've read about and we've talked about into that panel discussion, or?
Yes and no, because the panel discussion was kind of about a specific topic.
Yeah.
So it would have been kind of off to loop in a book.
Yeah.
But why I was on that panel was because I put a lot of these books into practice in terms of like day in and day out stuff.
Yeah.
So in a way, yes.
Okay. For this week, our implementations, we had talked about doing a newsletter, and
as one of our implementations.
Yes. And after thinking about it
and reading this book,
exactly. After reading this book, we actually sat down yesterday for a few hours, and we kind of figured out our next processes. And Eric Ries talks about the runway that a company has left, and so the amount of times that the company can still pivot. And so we kind of figured, how many pivots do we have? And we were able to come up with a couple, but a newsletter wasn't one of those pivots. And so I think from that standpoint, we decided that right now a newsletter wouldn't provide any value for our audience.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Next week we will be reading Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. Don't forget to check us out on our socials, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcast at Bound to Improve. See you next week.